Thanks everybody for showing up. I know half of the class messaged me and was like, I'm already on a train, so it's nice to not talk to an empty room. Going to be going over a bunch of stuff today, but because I figured you guys showed up, I wanted to give you guys a choice for what we talk about tomorrow. It's completely up to you. You have two options. So if you just want to scan that real quick, basically the choices are learn how to set up and manage your own database and like write and query to it and whatnot. Or alternatively, learn how authentication works not in Firebase. I think both of these are incredibly useful real-world examples that you'll use constantly going forward as devs. And for both of them, you guys are going to get good chunks of code that you can just reuse. So. I do have one of these lessons written already, so I'm hoping for one, but I'm not going to say which. Let's see what we got. Okay. Okay, I'm assuming it is an even split. We'll probably do authentication in that case. Anyway. So we've alluded to a couple times some of the biggest problems with state in React, and it's that it can be tricky to manage when you have a larger application. You know, I've mostly shown you guys components that have one, maybe two child components in places. And here's one of the issues. It's accessing state in a way that isn't bloated and hard to deal with and hard to code and hard to maintain. So if we have, let's talk about, imagine each one of these nodes is a component, okay? So let's talk about, at first, components B and C. And let's say that they have to use some type of state. We'll just call it count, because we've been doing buttons. So they both have to access count, and they both have to get count, and they both have to have some way to set it, so a function to set it. Does anybody know where we would have to declare the state so that they could share a state? Like, which node would we declare it at so that that would work for us? You can just shout it out.
The one that, like the ancestor, the one that they
Exactly, D. What if we were doing B and L?
Oh.
Yeah. So now we have to pass this down to every single, O has to pass this state to E, to D, to C, and to N, to M, to L. So when we go into the props, for every single time that we make a new child component, it has to go into the props. And this is referred to as prop drilling. It's one of the biggest disadvantages of state in React. So there's really three solutions. One is prop drilling. It's okay if your application isn't that complex, but as soon as you're passing 10 or 20 or however many things you're passing to a child component, it starts to get bloated. Two is going to be something called the use context hook. So with use context, we can access state at every single level of a tree where we define context. And I'll show you an example, but right now, if we were to wrap this entire tree in a use context hook, context could be our count, for example, we'd be able to get it at every single one of the layers. We'd be able to modify it at every single one of our child components. So typically this would be for things like, is a user signed in? You put it in context. Are we using light mode or dark mode? Context. Like, let's say, here's an example. If you load Twitch TV, they have both a sidebar on both the left and the right-hand side. If you don't even have an account and you minimize those bars and you sign back into the site, it's going to have them be minimized. They're using context there or something similar with whatever framework they use. And they're storing it in this case, it's going to be probably local storage. So let's take a look at how use context works in a second. But I wanted to mention this, we're not gonna do this. There's something called Redux and other state management libraries. These are for like huge enterprise level applications. And what Redux does, it's kind of like, I would say it's a key value database, sort of. It's not really a database, but for state. So basically you have a store, it holds the state, simple enough. You're able to access it. These are all the fancy words of dispatch and reducers. Those are React words, but basically you can put the state in the store, you're able to access state from the store, and then you're able to modify state as needed. Redux is annoying to use. You only use it if you have to, and nobody likes doing it. Cool, so let's take a look at some use context here. not that one. So, right off the bat, so we're using this hook in React. So this is, I kept this as simple as possible. I didn't even provide a function to modify the context, but you would do it just like state. Right off the bat here, I have const theme context is create context. Now that's a React hook where we're creating the initial context. And we're setting it to light. So that would be called our fallback value here. If we don't provide it anything, it just falls back to light mode. We have a type here, I called it theme. Can it be a string that's light or a string that's dark and nothing else? And we're exporting this theme context, which is just creating a context. So if we look over here at theme provider, let me see if I can actually space this out to make it look a little bit. I actually won't be able to. Autosave is going to format it. So here's what's happening. We provide the context to every child node. Now, typically, when we have written basically components within other components, it's been an actual component here that we specify, like box or count or whatever. In this case, let's take a look at what children actually is. Children, it's just a React node. That's it. So when we destructure this, so we have our children, which is just our props from our interface. Basically, we're saying this is going to provide the value of dark because we're setting it right there. We're setting it to dark. Again, we're not manually changing this in this example. And then we're just providing this to all the children. So if we wrap our entire application in this, every single component in the tree will have access to that value of dark. If we wrap part of our application in this, maybe the bottom half of the tree. The bottom half of the tree will get access to that. So let me show you how this would work. Oh, sorry, one sec. I broke something. So I commented this out. We can ignore this for now. Chakra provider, please ignore. That actually is using context, but it's for something I'm going to talk about in about 10 minutes. So we have our theme provider here. Now, theme provider here is wrapping. Right now, I commented that all out, but it's also wrapping this chakra component. Let me uncomment this. Import. Oh boy, add all imports. There we go. Now, what I'm looking for specifically here is theme display. Now, theme display is a component that I wrote. This is as simple as it gets. Before we used the create context hook in order to create context. Now we're getting context. So theme context was our created context. We're now const theme equals use context of that context. So we're getting that context. And then basically we just use this like its state. Just a div, the current theme is. And then if we see over here, dark. And that's because if we take a look at when we created it, the fallback value is light. If we didn't do anything anywhere, this would be light. However, in our app, you see we use the theme is equal to dark. Oh, sorry, wrong place. There it is. Sorry, theme provider provided the value of dark. So dark was then given to all the children, everything that's using context. So that's why we see dark appear instead of light. Don't let the non-night mode trick you. Cool. So that's context. That's honestly, if you understand state, just use the use context hook, make a provider, and then wrap your app in the provider, and you'll be good. Again, this is mostly for application-wide things like who's the user, light mode or dark mode, things like that. Yeah.
So like, if you didn't pass it down to the children, then would like on like a website, if you were in dark mode and you like click to like a different page or something, then would it go back to light mode? Like how would it work if it wasn't correctly passed down to the children?
So if we didn't pass, so if right here we're doing value is dark, right?
Yeah.
If we did not pass this and just did this, I was in the right place. And just did this, Now I actually need to provide something here because of the way I wrote the types. But if I did light, for example, it would pass it down to light mode everywhere. Did I get your question or did I miss it?
So, like, what would happen if you didn't pass it to the children? Like, if it was incorrectly passed to the children, would the code just not compile?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. TypeScript's really good about that. If you don't provide something that you said you will provide, TypeScript won't let you run it. And that's sort of one of the reasons why I'm so big on TypeScript. We catch this. You saw me. I tried to delete it and I got an error immediately. And I went, oh yeah, I didn't write it like that. JavaScript would let us do this and then it would bomb out. TypeScript won't even let us do it. Think like Java or C++ instead of Python. Same sort of approach. Did anyone else have anything? Cool. So I wanted to talk about forms real quick because forms are really important. Let me go back. So when you're submitting forms, this is on websites all the time, entering your details to buy something, logging in, anything where you're entering multiple pieces of information and then submitting all at once. There's special ways that you can manage this, both in just regular old JavaScript and React. Basically, you have to handle submit for the form. It's a special function. We're going to take a look at a library that really helps us with forms. It's called Formic. There are others. But Formic is basically the standard. You can also use it. I've actually never done this, but I've seen it a bunch. There's something called Yup, and Yup is just another library which you use to verify whether or not your data looks like how it is supposed to look. If it doesn't, it makes it easier to throw errors and display them to the user. This is for things that are more complicated probably than we'll be doing in dev, so I'm not going to go into it, but I just wanted to mention. Okay, we'll come back to that. So let's take a look at our form. I'm going to go back to the app. I've got a login form here that I want to show. Okay, so I kept it really simple. We got a username and a password. No styling, nothing like that. Let me show you what's going on with the actual login form. So from Formic, there's a couple things that we have to import. I want to be clear. I don't know how to do this off the top of my head. Every time I have to do something like this, I reference old code that I've written, or more likely, I'm going to look at their docs. I just type up Formic documentation. They're typically going to have stuff that you can copy, paste, drop in. So like when you guys see me having this code pre-written, this isn't memorized. Just read the documentation. ChatGPT probably will be pretty good at it too, as will GitHub Copilot. But the docs will never steer you wrong. So we import a bunch of things specifically from Formic. Great, we have initial values that we set here. You typically want to have initial values on the form. And here's our handle submit function. What this is, typically we would be making an API call to an endpoint or editing something in a database. I didn't set any of that up, I just mocked it. But we're passing in values, which are our form values from up here, and a destructured set submitting, which I actually couldn't figure out what type this was and I didn't want to spend time on it. You shouldn't do this. And then we're just popping up an alert saying, yay, we submitted. Validation is really important for the form values. And this is like a really simplistic example. This is something you would use Yup to do typically. But basically if my email isn't there, you got to put the email. Else if, and this is copied and pasted, I don't know how to write regex off the top of my head. So if it doesn't have an @ sign or a period in it, say it's a bad email address, right? Also, if the password isn't there, same thing. Return errors. And errors, I want to call attention to this. We see partial form values. I did not explain partial when I talked about TypeScript. Partial is something you will see come up. So if we take a look at form values, we have email and password as mandatory values. We have to provide them. But what if we don't have these in our errors? Well, I talked about you can return errors or you can return null. One other option is you can return partial of the type. Now what partial does is it just makes all these optional. It's the equivalent, partial form values is the equivalent of what I just put. The question mark says this is an optional field. We don't need it. You can provide it if you like, otherwise it's null. So that's why we're returning a partial for form values, and so on and so forth. Now if we actually look down here, make this a smidge bigger. If we actually look down here, we see a formic component. It's going to want us to pass in initial values, what to do when we submit, and how to validate. And that's pretty standard for most form libraries and most types of form control. And I'm just dropping in forms here, or dropping in components here. I use their form component. That's just formic's component, and we need to pass in this case, if we don't pass in anything, or don't wrap anything, it'll have an error. But this is going to be pretty standard from docs. Type is email, ID is email, name is email. These are just things, I forget which is which, to be honest. I think type is going to be, you know how your browser will say this is a password, it knows what a password field is? I believe type gets that. I think ID is used for actually giving IDs, IDs being so that your browser can also identify not just what it is, but what should go in it. And then name, I honestly don't remember. But typically, you just have the same one for all three. I think you can put ARIA label as well, which is just for like screen readers for people who are vision impaired. Same thing, it would just be email. Error message. This is their component. Give it the name is email, so it corresponds to the email div. I'm not going to read this all out. Let me show you what happens when I actually try to put something in. Colin at gmail.com. Password. Let's try submitting. Great, and my alert popped up, and it gave me the data back. So I said, when I handle submit, just give me the data back. Now, if there's a problem, and this is why formic's really cool, or one of the reasons, immediately we have an error when we try to type something in with no. It shows the error automatically under the label if you put the div right under it. If I try to type in Colin Gmail, it's going to know that it's an invalid email address. And you can do all sorts of logic. You can make it red. Typically, a pretty standard practice is you don't want to move everything else on the page down. You want to put them in a div that has a certain height, and then just choose to show email address, invalid email address or not, based off of whether or not it's there. So it won't move everything down like it currently is. But that's front-end stuff, which I didn't want to talk about today. I know I kind of glazed over that. Does anybody have any questions about forms in general? This is one that I just wanted to just look at the formic docs when you have to do this. It'll be much easier than me trying to explain it. Yeah.
Like, what is formic? Yeah, like, what is formic?
So I'm going to start off with what are forms in JavaScript and HTML. So forms are a thing in HTML. There's a special tag for form. The whole point of form is that it has something that, a function that when you submit it, something happens. It's not like clicking on a button. When you click on a button, what happens is you can move a div around on the screen, or you can increment a counter. When you submit a form, typically you're making some network request to somewhere, or you're moving the user to a new page and routing them somewhere else. So it's handled. I don't want to say it's handled differently because it's a little bit vague, but it does more and is capable of doing more than just an unclick for a button, unless you really want to build out your unclick to be crazy. What we're doing in most cases, when you submit a form, you put in all the values. So in this case, we just have the two. We have our password and our email. We see that the formic is taking the initial values set up here, which are just our form values, email and password. And when we edit them to be whatever we type in, now this is a little bit obscure, but if we look at, for example, the form class, let's take a look at the field. This is going to be, so I'm going to command click. This is going to bring me to their code. It's going to look a little bit obscure. This is some TypeScript nonsense, to be honest. But we see it has a validation function, has a name, it has render, which is the ability to actually render itself on the page, and then any children that it has. So that is our component field. It's also got a bunch of other stuff, component, class name, more props, etc. But essentially what we're doing with the form is we're tracking, and this is an oversimplification and not quite right. We're tracking a bunch of pieces of state at once so that we can submit them all at the same time. Imagine it, let me go back to this form. Imagine if we were trying to have a different piece of state for each box on this form. It's going to become a bit of a nightmare to try to deal with. Imagine if this form is like filling out a bank application with 100 fields, you know, something really serious. It's just going to make it, one, a lot more manageable, and two, it's just typically what's done is we use forms. Yeah, could you track one piece of state for each one of these things, make a network request with all that stuff? Sure, but then you have to have a special validation function for each type of state. You have to have a whole bunch of complicated if-then logic. The form lets you do it all at once and treat it as a collection of data rather than individual pieces. I think it will be easier. This is something that when someone explained it to me, I didn't understand. And when I had to do it and I looked at the docs, I went, oh. Maybe that's disparaging to my ability as a teacher, or my ability to grasp things. But I really think that this is one that will be easier when you have to do it yourself. Leo, did I miss anything major on forms that would make it just click?
I think I go.
Yeah, they're
They're pretty chill.
yeah. We got an update, and it's databases. Okay. So Reed's not here today. Reed is really good at front end. He won't tell you that. He's like, yeah, I just like making stuff. He's really good at making stuff look good. I am not. I'll be the first person to tell you that. So there's a lot of options out there for people who don't want to write their own CSS or want to use other people's UI, UX experience. The main one that I would point you guys to is component libraries. So every time in React when we make a component, in this case we made a form, it looks like crap. We didn't do anything to it. There are libraries out there, there's a bunch of them, that have everything pre-styled for you, and you just drop it in. You don't have to write the CSS. It all looks consistent according to the style of people who went to design school, not me. So I want to talk about two of them. I'm going to show you how one of them works. I use these guys all the time. So the two biggest ones are Material UI, which I'm probably at least some people here have heard of, and Chakra UI, which I would be surprised if people have heard of. So basically, we literally just go to their docs. I Google Material UI components and see what they have for us. So if I want to make, I don't know, a ratings star. If I wanted to do that myself, I'd have to draw out or get pictures of stars. I'd have to either get pictures of half-filled stars and change the image on the page based on where they click. Use this image of 4 stars. Use that image of 2 stars. I'd have to get the coloring right. Or I can just drop in their component that they already have written. I know that you guys have seen 100 different websites that use Material UI. And we just look at it. You install Material UI in your project, so you add that dependency. Typically when you make a project that you know is going to be using Material UI, they'll have some just, instead of npx create React app, it'll be like npx create React app with Material UI or something. Just find it in their docs. And you literally just drag and drop this guy right into there. And we can see rating is probably their component for the top one up here. Or typography is controlled. So typography is probably their word for just a paragraph. Rating is going to be their actual stars. And if we look at this, let me make it a little bit bigger for you guys. If we look at this, this is just a component. We're not like making a bunch of divs and whatnot. We're using their rating component that they already made. So we see that they're passing in simple controlled as a value. If you ask me what that is, I don't know, but it'll be documented here. If I scroll down probably a paragraph, we'll say something about simple controlled. If not, it'll be somewhere else in the docs. And you can see value is value. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. This onChange function, just set a new value. Sure. This looks pretty easy. And instead of spending a while getting these set up, we can just use theirs. Now that's a simple example. Let's look at something probably a little bit more complicated. Toggle button, that's not too hard, but it's got a nice little animation when you click on it. So if I wanted to use this, I would grab this, drop it in. It's that simple. ARIA label is just going to be for screen readers. Sizes, they probably have a small, medium, large. Sure. And the cool thing about this is that it is styled in such a way that every single one of their components is designed to look good with all of the other components, and they're designed to be easy to use. If you make a site with Material UI, it's going to look like a Material UI site every time. Like, people are going to know, oh, that's Material UI, and that's both in a really good way. It looks sleek and professional, but also you lose a lot of control. When you're writing raw CSS, you can make something look like anything you want. Now, for me, that's a bad thing because what I want it to look like doesn't look good. But if you know what you're doing and want to put in the effort, yeah, it's going to look unique. It's going to look like your site. For small teams, a lot of time for like small dev teams or just solo dev projects, there's a lot of people who use stuff like this. As soon as you're working at a company at like an enterprise level, nobody's using stuff like this, not really. Maybe Material UI, but none of the other ones. And then we can see them get significantly more complicated. Feedback will be, this is a pretty standardized look. Like, I know you guys have seen stuff like that. Just drop it in. Severity, success, sure. And so on and so forth. Now, Material UI also has templates. The premium templates, I believe you have to pay for. Material UI. So, great. If you want to make something that looks like that, you drag and drop it in and just use your own values for state. The idea is that you can focus more on building out apps a lot faster, but you do sacrifice some control over what things actually end up looking like. But I wanted to talk about Chakra just to show you guys how these would actually work when you're using them. Chakra is the same exact idea. Material UI is the biggest. Chakra is the second biggest. I've built a lot of stuff with Chakra. So again, some of these are going to be pretty simple stuff. So these actually spin when you use them. Great. Loading bars. I don't want to make a circle with another circle going around it in CSS. Reed can probably do it in 30 seconds. I can't. I just can't. But it gets more complicated. If we want to do, I don't know, something like this. I know for a fact that that's hard to do well and look good in CSS. But this way we can just drag and drop this code. We have a drawer already made for us. So let me show you how this works a little bit. Let me go back to my app. Do an OK on time. You don't actually need that one yet. So Chakra component is just what I called my component that I'm exporting. And we can build from these. So their box, this is just a div. So if over here, if I go to where I'm serving the site, nothing special that if we did this with just div, just to show you as an example, there is one difference. You can probably see it. Font's different. Chakra has a standardized font. They just use it for everything. Material UI, same exact thing. Here's where it shines. If I want to adjust the margin, instead of writing a whole CSS file and having a different ID for every box on here, or doing class selectors or anything like that, I can just do immediately, like that. If I want to do padding, now it's padded. And so on and so forth. If I want to change the background color. And we can just keep doing this forever. Something that's nice, it's just a little thing. Most of these component libraries also have shorthand for commonly used things. So margin top would be MT. Same thing, padding would be P. Don't have background color memorized. That might not have one, but again, this isn't going to be a huge deal when we just have one component like this. Imagine if this component had, I don't know, a component tree of 10 components, and we wanted each one to look a little bit differently and adjust the margin and the padding and the color and the this and that. I think this is easier. It was designed to be easier. So again, just to show you sort of the value in using something like this, writing this drawer would be a disaster for me. This would probably take me like a solid hour. And it still wouldn't look as good. Had all missing imports. Oh, I didn't copy everything, sorry. I missed something. Well, I was trying to show how this is easier, and it clearly did not do that. I don't want to waste time on this. Essentially, when whatever small problem this is gets worked out with types, it might just be that it's slightly deprecated. Cool, we're good. And obviously we can put whatever values in there. We can put whatever logic we want on save. That might be place the order, or if we have some Stripe integration, that might just be the finalization of paying for something. Again, we're gonna have some control over how wide we want it to be, how fast we want it to open, things like that, but don't need to go into any of that. That's enough about component libraries for now. So, finally get into the stuff that I want to talk about. It's the stuff that I'm actually know a little bit more about. Backends. So far, we haven't done anything related to backends whatsoever. React has been entirely on the front end. We've been making requests to some other endpoints that other people have set up using like test to-do lists or like test APIs or things like that. But I want us to be able to set up our own, at least basically, so that we can serve our own content if we want to. We can have our own web servers. And typically what we'll see when we're doing full stack app development, at least in many cases, is we have a separate front end and a separate back end. And when we set up the back end to work with our back end server in our database, the front end queries the endpoints that we have set up. I've used this term endpoint. I don't know if I've ever explained it. Endpoint is basically just where we go to get data or change data or interact with a server or alternatively a database in some way. So we can set up our own endpoints, deal with our own data, etc. So I want to show you guys a little bit of the architecture going on behind the scenes because when I learned this, I didn't understand any of it and it made it a lot harder. So NodeJS. Node.js is a server running JavaScript. It is how we run JavaScript off of a browser. When we set you guys up with Node.js at the beginning of this class, what you're doing every time you type node testfile.js is you're setting up a server to run that JavaScript. And the way Node.js deals with an event-driven programming is just it waits for something to happen, deals with the request, gets a response. And while this isn't super important for this class, it's single-threaded. So it can only do one thing at a time, but it does them very, very quickly. Basically, you just get in line, wait for your turn, which if the server isn't overloaded will be essentially immediately, and you get a response back. So Express is something you'll hear about a lot. Express is sort of the jelly to the peanut butter that is Node. You really never see one without the other, typically. Express is a server. It's super lightweight. It's like the most supported server in the world for dealing with JavaScript. And it's how we actually set everything up on our back end to serve content, whether that be images, whether we can provide JSONs to people, whether something as quickly as a response saying, this is a 404, you asked for something bad and we don't have it. So it's a little bit tricky at first. So when I talk about request response, what happens is a client makes a request. Now that could be you clicking on a button on a website. It could be you trying to access a website. Something of you interacting with this endpoint. You make a request. Node gets the request. Node can do things to the request, but typically you handle it at the Express level. Node passes the request, once Node is in control of it, to Express. Once Express has it, that's where most of the stuff actually happens, whether it be talk to a database, run some middleware, drop the request entirely. Express is where we actually do all of everything related to network requests, for the most part. Express then will call its middleware. What middleware is something that just runs in between getting a request and a response. And that can be any logic we want. Most servers, for example, that are doing real work for companies might have some middleware set up that says, hey, every time someone makes a request to, I don't know, this important resource, let's log their IP address. And that would be middleware. That would be Express saying, get their IP address, write it down somewhere. It could be something like, let's check to make sure that they're actually authenticated before they try to access their bank account. Things like that. You know, if you log into your bank account, once you're logged in, you can then go to other routes in the bank account. It might be /accounts, /Zelle, /digital assistant, whatever. What's happening there is these routes are protected by middleware. There's some middleware running to say, check their, however the bank does their authentication, check to make sure that they still have their token that we gave them. If they don't, they can't see this page. And it's a really robust and honestly simple way to protect people from going to places where they shouldn't be going in applications. There's other types of middleware, but it's pretty important and it's a pretty big part of backend development. Once you transform the request or drop the request or fulfill the request, you then give that back to Node and Node gives it back to the client. That is our essential full cycle of a request response. And you'll hear me say the words request response about 30 times in the next 5 minutes. But does anybody have any questions before I get more into this? Cool. So HTTP and HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol and Hypertext Transfer Protocol secure, I think. Basically, HTTP is insecure, HTTPS is secure. Now, when we make a request over a network like this, typically we're doing so over HTTP. Once we're at the Node server, we're already secure. The security is with actually setting up the Node server to be at a secure endpoint. Once we're there, we just do HTTP requests. There are, I think, 7, I want to say. These are the 4 that really matter. I'm sure you guys in your CS classes have heard some professors talk about CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. That's what we got going on here. Post request, put something there. Get request, read it, put. I always honestly mix up put and post. Put is update and delete is delete, right? So I'm going to show you how to set up an application so that we can do some of these there, how we can serve some content, etc. And error codes. Everybody here has seen a 404. Everybody here has probably seen 500 level error codes. So good practices, and actually it's better than good practice, you need to do it a lot of the time, is return not only with your, let's say you're giving back a JSON or something, you don't just give back the JSON, you give that back the JSON with a status. It's just a status, it's res.status typically, saying this is good, this is bad. And there's a bazillion error codes. These are probably the most common ones. 200 is the one that's the most common. The 200 block is something is good, everything's okay. 202 you'll see a lot as well, which I forgot to put on here. 300 is something funky went on. You very rarely see those. If you're seeing a 300 level request, it's like you tried to mess something up most of the time. 400 is the client did something they weren't supposed to. If you try to go to a website that doesn't exist for a route that doesn't exist, yeah, that's a 404, there's nothing there. 500 errors is the company messed something up. typically like they're being DDoSed or doing maintenance or something like that. So typically we return one every time we return an actual payload. When I use the term payload, it's just the data associated with the request or response. And that is it for my slideshow. Let's get back into coding. So I have two of these guys set up already. One is a really simple endpoint. One is a little bit trickier. So we can see in this project, I called it Tailwind. Tailwind was something I was supposed to mention. Tailwind is another way to do CSS. It's like writing the CSS in the actual divs, but without using a component library. I like doing it. Some people like doing it. It's worth knowing what it is. So let's take a look at our backend over here. Now I'll tell you right now, the backend needs to run on a different port than the front end. The front end in React by default runs on port 3000. So I've got this backend running on port 4000. So when I access localhost, that's the IP address. IP addresses have like 60,000 some ports associated with them, just for application usage. Let's go to port 4000, which is where I'm running my backend. Great. It's still running. Let's take a look at what it is. So I just initialized a TypeScript project to set this up. We see our dist folder, right? We see our TS config, simple enough. Let's take a look at the source here. We'll see, typically, we'll have a couple folders. We'll have typically routes, controllers, views is something that we won't be seeing because we do React, but it is also there. And then middleware and public. You might see something like utils, like utility functions that people use, but index.ts has to be at the top level, or should be. And index.ts should be one under source. Let's see what's going on index.ts. So, this is something I wanted to talk about. I mentioned that Node can do some stuff. One thing that Node can do is read files. So I have a file that I included in source public file.txt. So probably the only thing that I've really ever used Node's functionality for is its file system. We just have to import fs from fs. We read the file. We say where it is. It's UTF-8 encoded. You just basically always put that. It's a type of encoding. And I just was console logging the data. So if I look at file, I called it what's up. If you see down here, it says what's up. So simple enough. Let's look at Express, though, because that's what I actually really wanted to talk about. We're seeing here, here's another library. This is just creating a path from the name of where it is in the directory with then folder, with then file.txt. You see I console log that. You'll see this path.join a lot is pretty common. So const app equals express. That's us creating our Express app. I've never seen this called anything that isn't app, but obviously you guys can call it whatever you want. App.use express.json. So that's just middleware that parses JSONs for us. This is, you'll pretty usually or frequently use something like this if you're doing anything with JSONs. App.use cores, we're going to come back to this. And this is the first thing that we're doing. So we talked about get requests. A get is just read something from this resource. So this slash is our home route. If we go to the website, that's home. That's what the slash is. We have, I've mentioned this before, but you probably have never seen this. I don't even know if Java or C++ have this. If we do something like this, and these request responses are types from Express that we import, TypeScript's going to complain because we're not using this. So what we just do is just an underline to say something should be here, but we're not allocating any memory for this. It's a micro optimization, makes your code cleaner. Looks good in interviews if you do it. So right here we're doing, let me do actually an even simpler version. So res.send get request received. That's it. We have a message of get request received. Actually, I'm sorry, that did not refresh. This is supposed to be refreshing. There's a library that you can run called NodeMon, which automatically refreshes things like this. Let me try this again. PM run dev. Oh, and now because I changed it back. Standard. Okay. Either way, what we're supposed to do, instead of just sending back the response, we send back a status along with a JSON. So status.json, we include the status we want. And in this JSON, let's include a payload of just a simple message. So if we look at our developer tools, we should see, if we go over network, sorry, we should see, oh, this is because I didn't, let me try again. Yeah, this is because I don't have NodeMon running, sorry. Okay, I actually don't know what's going on with that. My apologies, this was working good before. Where's that status? Apologies on that one. I'm gonna keep moving on though. So there's a couple ways that we can test this. There's actually three main ways that we can test our API functionality. One is by going to it in our browser. That's simple enough. The second way is by doing something called curling it. I don't remember what it stands for. It's curl. It's a Linux command. So what we can do is basically use curl to make HTTP requests to an endpoint. So in this case, we just type this from anywhere. The .x flag you do need, which specifies that we're doing a GET request, and we're just saying the URL. Now this should give us this message. Cool. We can see GET message received, simple enough. And something that we actually do need to curl for, or use the other method, which we might cover if we get enough time. We can't do a put request just by going to an endpoint. If we're trying to put something or delete something, it's really hard to test that way. So curl is a good way to do it if you have fairly simple needs. Once they get a little bit more complicated, we're going to use the third way. But let's try a post request here. So app.post, we're just defining how it should handle post requests to this endpoint. So if we go to localhost 4000/test, we should be getting a response back, status 200, JSON of an object. So it's just first name Hoya, last name dev. So if we try to curl that, because we can't just do that in browser simply, cool. Looks good. Curl is a really, really handy way to make sure that your endpoints are working, especially when you're in the early phases of developing an app. And we can just continue to do the same thing for delete, for post, different routes, anything that we want. But let's do it something that's a little bit more complicated. What if we're going to a route that's specific to some information? What if we want our route to be like user / and then the user's ID, and the user has an ID of like 50,000,003. Well, we don't want to make a new route for every single user in our application. And how do we even do that if people are constantly signing up or closing accounts or whatever? So what we do is we use a URL parameter. Now, URL parameter is basically just saying, let's treat this guy as a variable. So when we go to user / something, in this case, it'll treat it as its ID. Now, when we make a request, requests include a couple things that are important. They have headers, they have parameters, and they have a body. So if we do const test equals rec dot, in this case, it's looking for a query, which we can also have with a question mark just instead of that. That's saying we're asserting that this exists. Question mark is typically used for let's look this up. And we also have response.json, response.status, things like that. But in this case, it's going to be rec dot. We have body, params, and headers. Headers we're not going to talk about in this class. Body is the full body of the message, and in this case, parameters is what we pass in, which is why we need it here. So we're passing in the parameters of, and then we see it defined up here, its ID. So we just want to have the ID there, is what we're calling it. So if we make a curl, or if we curl, oh, this should be delete actually. If we, and over here, this is the same thing, just for putting a user in. So if we want to put a user in, and typically we would associate this with a database of some logic that's, let's actually do something to create a user in our database, and we'll talk about that next class. But what we would be doing is we would be putting, we see user /123, that's saying let's create a user, which we would do on our database side, and put that in, just create a user. Ah boy, sorry. What did I put? Curl put 4000 user 123. I literally tested this an hour before I came here. I think something's going on with my Express server that I messed up, but I can tell you what's going on. I was not watching this TypeScript. Okay, so at least I think that's what's going on. So I talked about when you have a watch command running with your TypeScript, it's constantly compiling every time you make a change. I was not doing that, so when I was changing this, nothing was being added to the dist folder. It wasn't compiling down to JavaScript, so my changes weren't getting logged. So that makes me feel less stupider in one way, but more stupid in another. So npm run watch. So I'm in Chakra right now. I need to get out of Chakra and get into backend. There we go. So now I'm in watch mode. I'm going to run the actual server. Okay. There we go. Makes me feel a little bit better. Yeah, so we just put a user, made a put request with this user, and then we can see the request.parameters, which is just going to be the .id, is going to be what we're assigning, hopefully, into the database when we create somebody. Let's see. And we can do different routes as well. So if we go to /greet, I got one set up for let's greet the user. Greetings, great. Now we can see over here, I sent a response. I did not send a status. So if I check over here, it has a status 304, which is something funky went wrong, typically. Res. So I'll send a 200 instead. Man, it's been one of those weeks, let me tell you. Leo, what am I doing wrong? Res status send. Don't worry about it. Something else we can do, and this is probably the thing that I'm going to end on for today, is serve static files with our Express server. So typically when you access some image on like Wikipedia or something, or anywhere where you're downloading a file, it'll be on a web page and it'll live there, and you can click on it, and when you click on it, you go to a route that's actually serving just that image. So what I did here is I used the path.join. So I basically got the directory name. So in this case, the directory name is the root of the directory. So that's going to be Tailwind, that'll be backend for this one. Backend, and then we find where index is. So index goes, dot is up one level, goes to source, goes to public, goes to serves those static files. So if I go to source/public/express diagram, Cool. So we're serving up this file that was in our public over here. So that's just saying where the files are actually located. So it's saying go to the public directory, everything that's in there, just serve those at the name of them at the end of the URL. So that's why typically a lot of the time when you're on a website, these things will have really, really wacky names. It's because humans aren't going in and naming all of the millions of images on a website. They're just randomly assigning some string of characters to it according to some algorithm. So that's why when you download stuff, it's just these like bizarre strings of characters. It's automatically generating that, putting them all in the same directory, and then it's serving everything in that directory according to its randomly generated name. So I know that was a lot. It looks like tomorrow we're going to spend a little bit more time on Express and figure out how to integrate that with a database. Does anybody have any questions for like the 2 minutes we got left? Cool. Yeah, we're going to call it. I will see everybody tomorrow. I think it's databases, but I'll double check. Yeah, thanks for coming.